I lost him in the space of a breath, and I have never forgotten how small a breath can be. One moment Leo's hand was in mine, hot and impatient, twisting because he wanted to see the white horses. The next moment there was a horse where the boy had been, a real one, enormous, its iron shoe striking sparks off the wet stone a hand's width from my skirt, and the crowd surged, and the carriage wheel I had been pressed against rolled forward, and the little hand was simply gone. I called his name. I could not hear my own voice. The forecourt of Aldenmere had swallowed it whole, along with 10,000 others, on the loudest morning that quiet country had known in a generation. You must understand what kind of day it was, or you will not understand how a child can vanish on a stone square in full daylight with the whole world watching. I had served the House of Surd for 9 years by then, first as a reader to the old Margravine, and then, when she died, as keeper of the nursery rooms and aide to her son's wife. I had crossed 3 borders in a sealed coach to reach the kingdom of Veredin. I had stood in the cold of foreign customs halls while men in unfamiliar braid counted our trunks. I thought I had seen the weight of a state visit. I had seen nothing. I had seen the rehearsal of it. The thing itself, when it came, was a flood. The treaty that brought us was years in the building, a marriage of trade and salt and safe passage between 2 small realms that had spent a long century mistrusting each other across a strip of gray sea. The kind of agreement that great kingdoms sign with a pen and a yawn, but that meant everything to people like us, who lived on the wrong side of a tariff. The Margrave had brought his whole household to honor it, his wife, his ministers, his physician, his bannermen, and his 3 children, because a man who arrives without his children is a man who does not mean to stay friends. The youngest was Leo, 5 years old that spring, dark hair that would not lie flat no matter how I wet the comb. A habit of asking why until you wanted to weep, and a way of slipping his hand into yours in the dark that made you forgive him for all of it. I was charged with the children that morning above all things. The older 2, the girl of 11, the boy of 9, knew how to walk in a procession, how to keep their faces still, how to be furniture with a pulse. Leo did not. Leo had never in his life been still for the length of a held breath, and on the morning we arrived in the capital of Veredin, the city had arranged for itself the single most exciting spectacle a 5-year-old has ever been forbidden to touch. The forecourt of Aldenmere is a great paved square before the palace gates, ringed on 3 sides by railings of black and gold iron, and on the 4th by the gatehouse itself, which is older than either of our countries and looks it. On a feast day they say it holds a calm and decorous crowd. On the day a foreign prince arrives to sign 100 years of peace, it held a sea. Bodies pressed to the railings 10 deep, children hoisted on shoulders, vendors who had walked from the next county with trays of ribbon. And down the center of it all, the carriages, ours and theirs, the host kingdom's gilded state coaches and our own travel-stained coaches behind them, the horses lathered and stamping, the drivers shouting in 2 languages that the horses understood in neither. And the guards. I had heard of the KingsGuard of Veredin the way you hear of weather in a place you have never been, famous for their stillness. Red tunics, bearskin caps tall as a man's forearm, white gloves, the rifles they carried more as a vow than a tool. I had imagined them as decoration. As I stepped down from our coach into that noise, the first thing I truly saw of the kingdom of Veredin was a line of those men holding a crowd the way a seawall holds a tide, shoulder to shoulder, unmoving, while the sea threw itself at them and broke. I remember thinking, how strange to make a wall out of men who are not allowed to push back. I did not yet know the name of the man who would catch my whole life as it fell. None of us did. He was simply one figure in a long red line, his eyes forward, his chin level under the strap, a number on his collar I could not read from where I stood. I would learn afterward they called him Sergeant Ames Corvin, that he had served 11 years, that the men under him called him the post because he could stand a watch the way a stone stands a winter. I would learn that he had a daughter of his own, away in a village I have never seen, just past the age that Leo was that morning. But all of that came later, in the slow accounting we make of the people who save us. In the moment, he was only a wall in a wall, and my charge was slipping toward the gap in it. It happened the way disasters always happen, not in the dramatic part, but in the small distraction. The Margravine had stepped down ahead of us. The crowd had let up a roar at the sight of her. A herald was calling something I could not parse. The older children had been handed up the line toward the gate by a minister's man, and I had him, his hand in mine, and then a marshal in a sash bent down to me and asked in careful, accented Sardine whether the children were to go through the west arch or the court arch, and I turned my head to answer him, because I am a creature of duty and a question deserves an answer. And in the moment my eyes left the boy, a great pair of carriage horses was backed across our path by a driver fighting his own panic, and the crowd jolted sideways to make room, and the marshal stepped in front of me, and when I looked down the hand in mine belonged to the marshal's sleeve, and the boy was not there. I want to tell you I was calm. I was not calm. I have stood at a deathbed without weeping. I came apart on that stone in the space of 3 heartbeats. I dropped to a crouch and tried to see at his height beneath the forest of legs and skirts and boots, and there was nothing but motion, a churn of strangers, 1,000 pairs of shoes all going somewhere that was not toward a small lost boy. I shouted his name in Sardine, which not one soul in that crowd would know, and the sound of it was eaten the instant it left me. A woman trod on my hand. Somewhere a band began to play, brass and drums, the loudest thing yet, the official welcome, and under it I understood with a cold and total certainty that I had lost the youngest child of the House of Surd in a foreign country on the most public morning of his life, and that the horses were everywhere, and that he was the size of nothing at all. I have been asked since how long he was gone. They tell me it could not have been more than 4 or 5 minutes. I would have sworn before any court it was an hour. Time does that. It stretches around a missing child like water around a stone. The first thing I did wrong was run toward the gate, because that was where we had been going, and a part of my mind insisted he must have gone on without me, a sensible little man following the family. I shoved through bodies that did not yield, calling, and a constable in Veridin blue caught my arm and said words I could not understand and would not have heard if I could. I tore free. I doubled back toward the carriages, toward the horses, toward the worst place, because the worst place is where the heart goes. The drivers were still shouting. One of the state coaches had its door open and it stepped down and a footman trying to close it against the press of the crowd. And I thought, with a lurch of pure terror, that a child could climb into anything, that a child could be carried off in anything, that this square had 100 mouths and any one of them could have closed on him. That is when I saw the gap in the red line. It was the smallest thing. The line of guards along the inner cordon had stood unbroken since we arrived, a thing so fixed I had stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing a wall. And then one place in it was empty. One red shape had stepped out of the rank and was moving, not marching, not the slow ceremonial pace I had watched them keep, but moving with the low, fast economy of a man who has decided something, across the open lane between the cordon and the carriages, into the exact churn of horses and wheels and panic where I most feared to look. He went against the grain of the whole morning. Every other living thing in that forecourt was being pushed. He had chosen a direction. I did not understand yet what he had seen. I only understood that a man whose entire trade was holding still had broken from his post and was running, and that men like that do not run for nothing. And so I ran after him, because some animal part of me had decided that wherever a man like that was going in such a hurry, that was where the worst thing in the world was happening, and that the worst thing in the world was mine. He had seen what I had not. He told me afterward, in the plain way that men of his kind tell terrible things, as if reporting the weather. He had been holding the cordon, eyes forward, the discipline that lets a man watch a whole square without seeming to watch anything, and a low movement near the wheels of the rearmost state coach had caught the edge of his attention, a movement at the wrong height, the height of nothing that should be down there between the spokes and the stamping hooves. Most men would have called it a dog. He had served 11 years and he had a child the right age, and something in him refused the easy answer. He looked twice. And the second time he saw a small dark head, low to the ground, turned the wrong way, hands over the ears against the brass and the drums, frozen exactly where a frightened animal freezes in the open, in the path, in the one place a horse cannot see and a wheel cannot stop. Leo had not run from me on purpose. He had been swept. When the crowd jolted, he had been carried 3 steps sideways and gone down on his knees, and being a small creature in a forest of giants, he had done the only thing his body knew. He had crawled toward the nearest shelter, which was the deep shadow under a coach, between the great wheels, where the legs and the noise could not reach him. He had found the most dangerous patch of ground in the entire kingdom, and crouched in it with his hands over his ears, certain he had made himself safe. The driver could not see him. That was the thing that turns my blood even now. The driver of that coach sat 8 feet up behind 4 nervous horses, fighting the reins, and below and behind him, in his blind spot between his own wheels, was a child the color of a shadow. One slap of those reins, one lurch forward to make room for the procession, and there would have been no story to tell. There would only have been a sound and a silence after it, and a war where there might have been 100 years of peace. The guard reached him before I did. Of course he did. He had started sooner, and he had no skirts and no terror clouding his legs. But I was close enough to see the whole of it, close enough that I will be able to close my eyes on the last day of my life and see it still. He did not snatch the boy up. I have thought about that a great deal since. A frightened man, even a brave one, grabs, and a grabbed child screams and twists and bolts, and a child that bolts under a coach goes the wrong way. The guard did not grab. In the last 2 strides he dropped, went down to one knee on the wet stone in his white breeches and his polished boots, in the full sight of the crowd and the cameras of the great houses and the kings of 2 countries, and he put his own body between the boy and the horses. He set his shoulder and his back to the hooves. He made of himself a wall the exact size of a child, and only then, with the danger behind his own spine, did he reach. I saw his mouth move. I could not hear him. No one could hear anything in that din, but I learned later what he said, because Leo carried the words home and said them to his mother in a small voice that night and every night for a month after. The guard had not shouted. He had not commanded. He had bent his bare-skinned head down to the level of a terrified child and said, very low, the way you speak to a colt or to a man at the edge of a roof, "You found a good place to hide, but it's my watch now. Come stand behind me. It's my watch now." Leo did not understand the language. He told us this too later with the grave honesty of the very young. He did not know one word the man said. But he understood the kneeling, and he understood the held-out white glove, and he understood the back turned to the danger and the chest turned to him, because those things are spoken in a tongue older than any border. The child who would not take a stranger's hand in the safest of times reached up and took hold of 2 fingers of a white glove, and the guard closed his hand around that small fist the way you would close a hand around a candle in the wind, and he stood. He stood and he turned, and he brought the boy up off the killing ground and against his own red chest, and walked him out of the lane with his body still between Leo and the horses. Slow now, deliberately slow, because a man carrying something precious does not run with it through a crowd. And as he came clear of the wheels into the open, the band reached the end of its piece, and the brass cut off all at once, and into that sudden well of relative quiet the boy began, finally, to cry, the high helpless wail of a child who has held it together until the very second it is safe to fall apart, and not one heartbeat sooner. I reached them then. I do not remember crossing the last of the distance. I remember being on my knees on the stone with my hands out and Leo's wet face turning toward mine, and the sound he made when he saw me. I will not try to write that sound, and I remember the guard. I remember the guard most of all. Because in that instant, when the boy lunged from his arms toward mine, and I gathered the whole shaking weight of him in and pressed my face into his hair and wept the way I had not wept since I buried my own mother, the man could have walked away. His part was done. The child was found. The child was safe. The child was passing back into the hands he belonged in. A lesser man, even a good one, would have straightened his tunic and gone back to his place in the line, and let the foreign servant and the foreign child sort out their tears between them. He did not walk away. He stayed down on one knee on the wet stone beside us, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched mine, and he kept his white glove resting light, barely there on the small of the boy's back, the way you keep a hand on a thing to tell it the danger is over. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes moving across the crowd, across the horses, across the wheels, still on watch, still the wall, but he kept that hand where the boy could feel it. He did not lift it until the shaking under it had stopped. I have served great houses my whole life. I know the difference between a man performing a kindness for the watching kings and a man who has simply forgotten there are any kings to watch. He had forgotten. For the length of a child's storm, the most disciplined man in the most watched square in the kingdom, had let everything in his world shrink down to one small back under his glove, and the keeping of it. When at last the boy went quiet, hiccuping against my neck, the guard rose. He came up the way they all came up, all in one piece, his bearskin straightening the air above him. And I scrambled up too, clumsy, my knees soaked, and I did the only thing my torn heart could think to do. I caught his gloved hand in both of mine and pressed it and tried, in my broken few words of his language, to give him the whole of my country's gratitude in a single sentence, and managed only, thank you, over and over like a fool. He let me hold his hand for exactly as long as I needed to. Then he gently took it back, and he did something I did not expect and have never forgotten. He stepped back one pace, set his heels together, and he saluted not me. He brought his white glove up sharp and clean, and he saluted the boy, the 5-year-old, red-eyed and snotting and still hiccuping in my arms, the youngest and most useless guest at the whole grand affair, as if Leo were a visiting prince, as if a frightened child were the one person in that forecourt most deserving of a soldier's honor. And then he turned and he walked back to the gap in the red line, and he stepped into it, and he became a wall again, eyes forward, as though nothing at all had happened. As though he had not, 4 minutes before, broken the oldest rule of his post, never leave the line, to go down on his knees in a killing ground for a child whose name he could not say. It was only when he was back in his place, and the procession was lurching forward again, and I was carrying Leo toward the gate with his arms locked around my neck, that I understood the whole forecourt had seen it. You forget, in the center of your own catastrophe, that you are standing on a stage. I had been so deep inside the loss of the boy and the finding of him that I had not registered the obvious thing. This was the most watched square in the kingdom on the most watched morning of the decade. The great houses of 2 countries had filled the gallery above the gate. The host king himself was up there, and our margrave, and the men whose names were going on the treaty. And spread across the forecourt, behind every railing, 10,000 people who had come to see a prince had instead seen, by accident, the true thing, a red soldier on his knees in the path of horses, shielding a frightened stranger's child with his own body. I felt the change in the crowd before I understood it. The roar that had greeted the margravine had been the roar of a spectacle. What rose now, rolling along the railings as the news of what had happened passed from mouth to mouth faster than any herald could carry it, was something different, lower, warmer. It started near the carriages, where people had seen it close, and it spread outward in a wave, and it was not cheering exactly. It was the sound a great many people make when they have just been reminded, all at once, of something good they had half stopped believing in. By the time we reached the shadow of the gatehouse it had become a roar after all, but a roar with a different heart in it, and it was not for the prince, and it was not for the treaty, and every man in that red line knew exactly which one of them it was for, and not one of them turned his head. Inside the gate the marshals were frantic. A lost child of a foreign delegation is, I came to understand, very nearly a catastrophe of state. If anything had happened to Leo, and so very nearly something had, it would not have been a private grief only. It would have been an incident. The kind of thing that two suspicious countries, after 100 years of looking for reasons to mistrust each other, seize upon and never let go. A child of the visiting house, crushed in the host's own forecourt, under the host's own carriages, while the host's own famous guard stood by. I did not have the wit to think of any of this in the moment. The Margrave's chamberlain did. I saw it in his grave face when he came hurrying to meet us inside the gate, in the way he counted the children with his eyes, 1, 2, 3, all here, all whole, and shut his eyes for a second longer than a blink. We had come within 4 minutes and 4 feet of a wound that would not have healed in our lifetimes. And the man who had stood between us and it was, at that very moment, back at his post in the rain, having returned to it without being asked, without being thanked by anyone who mattered, as if he had merely picked up a dropped glove. The Margravine met us in the antechamber. She was a woman bred to keep her face still in any weather. You do not marry into a house like Surd and let your feelings show in front of foreign courts. And she kept it still now, while the chamberlain murmured to her what had happened. She held it together exactly until Leo let go of my neck and reached for her, and then she did not hold it together at all, and I will draw the curtain there, because some things are not for telling, even years on. I will say only that when she had her son against her and her composure back on her face, she lifted her head and asked the chamberlain one question, very quietly, in Saradine. "The soldier," she said, "who is he? I will know his name." It was not so simple as that, it turned out. The men of that red line do not give their names to grateful strangers. It is not their way, and there is a kind of pride in it that I have come to respect even as it maddened me. They are not individuals on the post. They are the post. The chamberlain made inquiries, careful ones, because nothing in a state visit is simple, and the line between gratitude and interference is finer than you would think. You cannot simply summon a host kingdom's guardsman to be thanked by a foreign Margravine. There are channels, there are courtesies. There is the delicate question of whether a foreign house praising one host soldier above the rest might be taken as a slight to the others or, worse, as the foreign house presuming to bestow honors inside a court that is not theirs. Diplomacy turns the simplest decency into a maze. So I did what the Margravine could not. I went back out. I told the chamberlain I needed air, which was not a lie, and I walked back through the inner court to the place above the gate where you can look down on the forecourt, and I found the red line still holding, the crowd thinning now that the procession was in, the carriages drawn off, the horses gone, the killing ground reduced once more to a wet stone square that had very nearly been the worst place in the world. And I found him. I knew him at once, though from above and behind he was identical to the men beside him. I knew the set of his shoulders, the exact stillness of him, the way you would know your own child's back among 1,000. He was at his post as if he had never left it. I could not go down to him. There was a whole apparatus of cordons and officers between a foreign aide and a host sentry, and I had sense enough left not to cause a second incident on the same morning. But there was a young officer near the gallery rail, a lieutenant by his braid, watching the square with the proprietary calm of a man whose men had just done well, and I went to him, and I asked him in my poor borrowed words, and then, when those failed, in the plain language of a woman who will not be deflected, for the name of the sergeant who had gone down for the boy. He looked at me for a long moment. He was young, but he had the eyes of a man who had already learned that the most important things on his watch were the ones that did not appear on any schedule. "You're the boy's woman," he said. "From the foreign house. It was not unkind. He's well, the little one." "He is well," I said. "He is with his mother. He is well because of your sergeant. I would give him my country's thanks. I would at least give him his thanks. Tell me his name." The lieutenant was quiet. Then he said something I did not expect, something that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that long day. "I'll tell you his name when I tell you what he gave up to do it," he said, "because you should know both or neither." And he told me. His name was Sergeant Ames Corving. He had served 11 years on the KingsGuard of Veredon, the last 6 of them on the great occasions, the days when the whole kingdom watched, because those were the days they trusted to their steadiest men. And the rule on those days, the rule above every other rule, was the one I had watched him break. The line does not move. Not for a fainting woman, not for a thrown stone, not for a man having a fit at the railings. There are others to handle those things, constables, marshals, the second cordon. The guardsman on the state line holds the state line, because the line is the thing the whole occasion rests on, and a line with a gap in it is no line at all. A man who leaves it for any reason has failed at the one thing he was placed there to do. That is the iron of it. That is what makes them what they are. He knew that, the lieutenant said, looking down at the square. Better than you or I ever will. He's the best man on this wall. He's the man we put where the king can see him because he never moves. 11 years and he has never once moved. He paused. And this morning, in front of 2 crowns and 10,000 people and every great house in 2 kingdoms, he moved. He left the line. By the book, and the book is the only thing we have, miss. Without the book we are just men in red coats. By the book, that is the worst thing a guard of his post can do. I felt the ground tilt. But he saved the child, I said. He saved. I know what he saved. The young officer's jaw was tight. I was watching. I'd have given a year of my life to see what I saw this morning. But you asked me his name, and I'm telling you the truth that goes with it. A man does not get to choose the half of his deed he keeps. He saved the boy and he broke the line, and both of those things are now true, and there will be men in the offices above this gate who will only be able to see the second one. There is an inquiry for a thing like this. There has to be. The line is sacred or it is nothing, and you cannot have it both ways. He knew that when he ran. He knew it would cost him, and he ran anyway. And he did it slow and careful and right so that nobody could say he panicked, because he wanted the record clean even as he was wrecking his own. I stood there in the cold wind off the gate, and I understood, finally, the size of the thing I had watched. It was not the size I had thought. I had watched a brave man save a child, which is a large enough thing. I had not understood that I had watched a man knowingly lay down the 11 faultless years of his life. The one thing a man like that has, his record, the proof that he is what he says he is, and lay it down without a word, without a flicker. In the 4 seconds it took him to decide that a stranger's child was worth more than his own good name. "He'll be all right," I said, and it came out as a plea. "Surely he—" "That depends," the lieutenant said, "on men above me," and he would say no more. I went back to the Margravine and I told her everything. I told her the man's name, and I told her what his name had cost. I watched her listen with her still face, and I watched the stillness change into something I had not seen on her in 9 years of service, a cold, focused, formidable resolve. She had buried her composure when she held her son. She put it back on now like armor. "They will not punish that man," she said, "not while I draw breath in this country." "My lady," I began, "it is not our court. We have no standing to." "We have a child," she said, "who is alive. That is all the standing I require." And she rose, and she sent for the chamberlain, and the chamberlain sent for the margrave. And within the hour the thing had moved out of my small hands entirely and into the great machinery of state. And I, who had held the boy's hand and lost it and watched it caught, became only a witness again, which is what I had always been and what I am now, setting it down. I do not know all of what passed in the rooms above the gate that afternoon. Aides like me are kept on the right side of certain doors. But I know the shape of it, because I have pieced it together from the things I was allowed to see, and because, years later, the Margrave himself, an old man by then, told me the rest one evening when the wine had loosened the seal on it. The treaty was meant to be signed at dusk in the great hall before both courts. The whole day had been built toward that pen and that page. And the Margrave, who had come 1,000 miles and spent a year of his realm's hope on that signing, walked into the chamber where the host king's men were laying out the formalities, and he did a thing that made every diplomat in the room go pale. He set a condition. At the last hour. On the day. The one thing you are never, ever supposed to do. He said, and I have this from his own mouth, he said to the host king's chief minister, I am told one of your soldiers left his post this morning to pull my son out from under a horse, and that he may face a charge for it. I am told the line is sacred in this house. I respect that. The treaty is sacred in mine. I will sign no treaty with a kingdom that would punish a man for saving a child. So I am afraid the line and the treaty have become the same question, and you must answer it before I take up the pen. The chief minister, the Margrave said, looked as if he had swallowed a stone, because it was an outrageous thing to say. It was interference in another crown's discipline, and on any other day in 100 years, it would have been the kind of insult that sends delegations packing and treaties into the fire. The whole apparatus of 2 countries strained at it. There were men in that room who would have advised the host king to take offense, to stand on his sovereignty, to remind the foreign Margrave whose house he stood in. A century of grievance gives a kingdom a great many reasons to be insulted, if it goes looking for them. And then the host king of Veredin himself, who had been listening from his chair by the window and had said nothing, stood up. He was not a young man, the host king. He had ruled long enough to have learned the difference between his pride and his honor, which the Margrave told me is the whole of the art of being a king, and which most men who wear crowns never learn at all. He crossed the room to the table where the treaty lay waiting, and he put one hand flat on the page, and he looked at the foreign Margrave for a long moment, and then he laughed a short, surprised, entirely human laugh, and he said, You think I would punish that man? He turned to his own minister. Is there an inquiry? There is always an inquiry, sire, when the line is left, the rule. I know the rule, the king said. I made half of it. Tell me the sergeant's name. They told him, Ames Corvin. Then let there be an inquiry, the king said, and let it find exactly what it will find, that on the morning of the state arrival, Sergeant Corvin of the KingsGuard left his post in the great forecourt. He paused, and the whole room held its breath, and the Margrave told me he thought, for one cold instant, that the host king truly meant to break the man on the rule. And let it further find, the king went on, that he did so to place his body between a horse and a child, and that he carried the child to safety, and that he then returned to his post unbidden and stood his watch out in the rain without a word of complaint or a request for thanks. Let all of that go on the record together. Because a line that a man like that would not break for a child, the king said, is not a line worth holding. The rule keeps the line. But the line was only ever there to keep people. He did not break the rule. He remembered what it was for. The Margrave said the room was very quiet then. As for the treaty, the host king said, and he took up the pen himself and offered it across the table, I find we are not as different as 100 years of fools have told us. You and you would not sign a treaty with a kingdom that punishes a man for saving a child. I would not sign one with a kingdom that would let me. It seems we agree on the only thing that ever mattered. And he held out the pen. They signed it at dusk, the 2 of them before both courts, and the 100 years of mistrust ended not over salt or safe passage or any clause that the lawyers had labored on, but over a sergeant's bent knee in a forecourt that neither king would have noticed if a small boy had not, by the grace of God and the eyes of one watchful man, been seen in time. There was an inquiry. It found what the king said it would find, all of it, set down together in plain words, and it cleared Sergeant Corvin of any fault, and more than that, it added a line to the standing orders of the KingsGuard of Veredin that I am told is read aloud to every man who joins that wall to this day. I do not have it word for word in their tongue. The Margrave gave me the sense of it, and the sense of it was this: that the line is held for the sake of the people behind it, and that no rule made to protect the helpless may ever be turned into a reason to fail them, and that a guard who must choose, in a moment that allows no time to ask, between the perfect keeping of the line and the saving of a life, has the king's own leave to choose the life, and the king's own word that he will not stand alone for it after. They call it the forecourt rule now. Younger men, the Margrave said, do not always know the morning it came from. They only know it is the one rule in the whole stern book that gives a man permission instead of taking it away. I saw Sergeant Corvin once more before we left Veridon, and only once. The Margravine had her way in the end, through all the proper channels, conducted with all the proper courtesies, and on our last morning the host king permitted a small and private thing. The sergeant was brought, off duty and out of the bearskin, in a plain dark coat that made him look younger and somehow less and more at once, to the antechamber where we waited. He stood very straight. He did not know quite what to do with his hands without a rifle in them. And Leo, who had spent 5 days telling everyone who would hold still that a red soldier had found him under the horses, broke from my side and ran the length of the room and threw both arms around the man's knees, because that was as high as he could reach, and held on. The sergeant looked down at the dark head against his leg, and for a moment the still, careful soldier's face came undone exactly the way it had come undone in the forecourt, just for an instant, the way a man's face does when something reaches the part of him he keeps behind the wall. He put one hand bare now, no white glove, just a man's broad hand on the boy's hair. And he said, in careful, halting Saradine, that he must have learned a word at a time across those 5 days for this one purpose. "Hello, young sir. I have wept at a great many things in my life. I do not think I have ever wept at anything the way I wept at that." The Margravine thanked him in his own tongue, which she had likewise learned for the occasion, crowned to soldier, with her son's hand in hers. The Margrave gripped the man's bare hand the way one soldier grips another, and the sergeant, when it was over, when the thanks of a whole foreign house had been laid at his feet, said only one thing, through the chamberlain, who translated it for me in a low voice that broke a little in the middle. He said, "He was the smallest guest you brought. On a day that big, the smallest things get lost. Somebody has to be watching for the smallest things. That's all the post is in the end. That's all it ever was." Then he bowed to the boy again, first before the crown, exactly as he had saluted him in the forecourt, and he asked leave to return to his watch, and it was granted, and he went. We crossed 3 borders home in our sealed coach, and the treaty rode with us in a locked case, 100 years of peace in a folder of vellum. Leo is a grown man now, with a small son of his own. He commands a company on the very border that treaty opened, and the 2 kingdoms have not raised a hand against each other in all the years between, and the trade flows, and the salt comes through, and children on both sides of that gray sea grow up never knowing they were ever meant to be enemies. I have told this story many times. People always want it to be about the treaty, because the treaty is the large thing, the thing that went in the books with the dates and the seals. But the treaty was only ever the frame. The picture inside it is a red soldier going down on one knee on wet stone in the path of horses, turning his back to the danger and his chest to a frightened child, in front of 2 crowns and 10,000 eyes, and choosing. In the 4 seconds the world gave him the smallest, least important, most precious person in the entire forecourt. The kings made the peace, but the sergeant made it possible with his knee on the stone and his back to the horses, the day he remembered what the line was for. I was there. I held the empty hand and I saw the full one catch it. And if you ask me, after all these years, what diplomacy truly is, what it is, underneath the vellum and the seals and the long cold tables, I will tell you it is a man you do not know, in a country not your own, going down on his knees for the smallest guest, lost on the biggest day, and standing the watch over him until the fear has gone out of his small back, and then saluting him as if he were a king. That is the whole of it, Everything else is only paper.